Imagine waking up one morning as a 12-year-old kid, and the police are standing in your bedroom. They're telling you that you need to leave your house right now. And as they're rushing you down the hallway, you accidentally look through a door that's slightly open. And what you see in that room is so horrifying, so unimaginable, that it literally burns itself into your brain forever. That's exactly what happened to Tim Slaten on September 4th, 1981. And here's the part that's going to make your stomach turn. The man who did this to his mother? Tim already knew him. In fact, Tim saw this man almost every single day. This man coached Tim's football team. He stood right behind Tim in the team photo. And for the next 38 years, Tim kept that photo in his room without ever knowing he was staring at his mother's killer. But before we get into the full story of what happened to Linda Slaten and how her killer managed to hide in plain sight for nearly 4 decades, if you're a fan of true crime stories that will keep you up at night, then you've come to the right place, because that's what we do here. So please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into this story. Linda Slaten was a 31-year-old woman living in Lakeland, Florida in the summer of 1981. Now, Lakeland is one of those mid-sized Florida cities that sits right between Tampa and Orlando. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where kids ride their bikes through the neighborhoods without their parents worrying too much, and where you leave your doors unlocked because nothing bad ever happens here. At least, that's what people thought. Linda was a mother of 2 boys. Her oldest son, Jeff, was 15 years old, and her younger son, Tim, was 12. By all accounts, Linda was a good mother who worked hard to provide for her kids. She had a job, she kept a nice home, and she was trying to build a stable life for her family. But Linda's life hadn't been easy, not even close. See, Linda had been married to a man named Frank Slaten, and their marriage was anything but peaceful. Frank was abusive. He was the kind of man who used his fists to solve problems, and Linda had suffered through years of that abuse before she finally found the courage to leave him. Getting away from Frank was supposed to be the start of a new chapter for Linda. She was supposed to be free now. She was supposed to be safe. But the thing about abusive relationships is that even after you leave, the fear doesn't just go away. You're always looking over your shoulder. You're always wondering if today is the day they come back. And Frank made it clear he wasn't happy about Linda leaving him. So Linda lived with this constant low-level anxiety. But she pushed through it because she had 2 boys who needed her. She had a life to build. And she wasn't going to let fear stop her from doing that. In the summer of 1981, things were actually looking up for the Slaten family. Tim was getting ready to start a new football season. He was excited about it because football was his thing. He loved the game. He loved being part of a team. And he had a coach that seemed to really care about the kids. That coach's name was Joseph Mills. Mills was in his late 20s at the time, and he seemed like a normal guy. He showed up to practice, he worked with the kids, and he didn't raise any red flags. To Tim, Coach Mills was just another adult in his life, someone who helped him get better at football, someone who encouraged him during practice. Tim had no idea that this man had already noticed his mother. The September 3rd, 1981 started like any other day in the Slaten household. Linda went to work. The boys went to school. Tim probably had football practice at some point. Just a normal Thursday in Lakeland, Florida. That evening, everyone came home. Linda made dinner. The boys did whatever teenage boys do. Maybe they watched TV. Maybe they did homework. Maybe they just hung out in their rooms. The point is, it was a completely ordinary night. At some point, Linda sent the boys to bed. Jeff went to his room. Tim went to his room. And Linda stayed up, probably doing the things mothers do when their kids finally go to sleep. Maybe she cleaned up the kitchen. Maybe she watched some TV. Maybe she just enjoyed the quiet. What Linda didn't know was that someone was watching her house. Someone was waiting for the right moment. Someone had been thinking about this night for a while. Now here's where things get murky, because for 38 years, nobody knew exactly what happened next. But based on the evidence that would eventually be uncovered, we can piece together what authorities believe took place. At some point late that night or very early on the morning of September 4th, someone entered the Slaten home. The boys were asleep in their rooms. Linda was alone and vulnerable. What happened next was violent and brutal. Linda Slaten was sexually assaulted and then strangled to death in her own home, while her 2 sons slept just rooms away. The killer then left the house. He walked out into the Florida night and disappeared. And for 38 years, that's exactly where the story stopped. The killer vanished like a ghost. The morning of September 4th, 1981, started with chaos. At some point that morning, someone discovered that something was terribly wrong at the Slaten house. Maybe it was a co-worker wondering why Linda didn't show up. Maybe it was a neighbor who noticed something unusual. The exact details of who made the call aren't entirely clear, but what is clear is that the police showed up at the Slaten home that morning, and they found Linda's body. She was dead. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and her 2 sons were still asleep in their bedrooms, completely unaware of the horror that had taken place just feet away from them. Now, imagine being the police officer who has to handle this situation. You've got a dead woman in one room and 2 children sleeping in other rooms. You have to wake these kids up and get them out of the house. You have to do this without traumatizing them any more than they're already about to be traumatized. That's an impossible task. When the officers woke up Jeff and Tim, they tried to shield the boys from what had happened. They tried to rush them out of the house without letting them see anything. But as they were moving Tim down the hallway, something went wrong. A door was slightly open. Maybe someone had forgotten to close it completely. Maybe Tim was just looking in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. But whatever the reason, 12-year-old Tim Slaten accidentally looked through that door, and he saw his mother's body. Years later, Tim would describe that moment as an image that was burned into his brain. Think about that for a second. You're 12 years old. You just woke up. You're confused about why the police are in your house. And then you see something that no child should ever have to see. That image stayed with Tim for the rest of his life. It haunted him. It shaped him. And it made him desperate to know who had done this to his mother. The Lakeland Police Department immediately launched a murder investigation. This was a big deal for a city like Lakeland. Murders like this didn't happen here. This wasn't Miami or Tampa. This was a quiet city where people felt safe. So the police threw everything they had at this case. The first thing they did was look at the most obvious suspect, Frank Slaten, Linda's abusive ex-husband. Now, if you know anything about homicide investigations, you know that when a woman is murdered, the first person police look at is always the husband or boyfriend. Statistics don't lie. In the majority of cases where a woman is killed, it's someone she was in a romantic relationship with. And Frank Slaten seemed like the perfect suspect. He had abused Linda for years. He was angry about the divorce. He had motive. He had opportunity. Everything pointed to him. The police brought Frank in for questioning. They interrogated him. They dug into his alibi. They looked at every aspect of his life. But here's the thing. Frank Slaten had an alibi. And as much as the police wanted him to be guilty, they couldn't make the evidence fit. They couldn't prove that Frank had killed Linda. So they had to look elsewhere. And that's when the investigation started to stall. See? When police don't have an obvious suspect, they start looking at other possibilities. They look at neighbors. They look at co-workers. They look at anyone who might have had contact with the victim. But in Linda's case, there was no obvious suspect besides Frank. There was no angry ex-boyfriend. There was no suspicious co-worker. There was no one who seemed to have a reason to kill her. The police did collect evidence from the crime scene, including biological evidence that the killer had left behind. This was 1981, remember? So DNA testing wasn't really a thing yet. The technology existed in a very primitive form, but it wasn't something that local police departments could use to solve crimes. So the biological evidence went into storage. It sat there in an evidence locker, waiting for technology to catch up. And the case went cold. Though, for Jeff and Tim Slaten, their mother's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was the beginning of a lifetime of fear and uncertainty. Think about what these boys went through. Their mother was killed in their own home while they slept. The killer was never caught, and for years, they had no idea if that person might come back. Jeff, who was 15 at the time, dealt with this fear in his own way. He started sleeping with a knife under his pillow. Every night he would make sure that knife was there, within reach, just in case. Just in case the killer came back. Just in case he needed to protect himself and his brother. A 15-year-old boy sleeping with a weapon because he's afraid of being murdered in his sleep. Let that sink in. And the fear wasn't just about the killer coming back. It was about not knowing who the killer was. Because when you don't know who did something terrible, everyone becomes a potential suspect. Every stranger on the street could be the one. Every new person you meet could be hiding a dark secret. The boys also had to deal with the police investigation, which at times seemed to focus on them as potential sources of information. Jeff, being the older brother, was interrogated multiple times over the years. Police wanted to know if he had seen anything, if he had heard anything, if he knew anything that could help them solve the case. Imagine being a teenage boy who just lost his mother, and the police keep bringing you in for questioning. Imagine having to relive that trauma over and over again as investigators try to find any detail that might help. It was exhausting, it was traumatic, and ultimately, it didn't lead anywhere. The boys eventually went to live with relatives. They tried to build normal lives, they went to school, they made friends, they grew up, but they never forgot, and they never stopped wanting answers. New Tolki, here's one of the most disturbing details of this entire case. Remember how I mentioned that Tim played football and that his coach was a man named Joseph Mills? Well, at some point during that 1981 football season, the team took a team photo. You know the kind. All the players lined up in their uniforms with the coaches standing behind them. Tim was in that photo, and standing right behind him, just a few feet away, was Coach Joseph Mills. Tim kept that photo. He put it in his room. And for the next 38 years, he looked at that photo without ever knowing the truth. Without ever knowing that the man standing behind him in that picture was the man who had killed his mother. Think about the psychological weight of that. Every time Tim looked at that photo, he was looking at his mother's murderer. Every memory he had of that football season was tainted by the presence of a killer. Every time he thought about his childhood, Joseph Mills was there, lurking in the background. But Tim didn't know. He couldn't have known, because the police never identified Joseph Mills as a suspect. His name never came up in the investigation. He was just the football coach, just another adult in the community. And that's how Joseph Mills got away with murder for 38 years. He hid in plain sight. He kept living his life. He probably passed by the Slaten boys on the street at some point without them ever suspecting a thing. It's terrifying when you really think about it. The killer was right there the whole time, and nobody knew. The years passed. The 1980s turned into the 1990s. The 1990s turned into the 2000s. And still, no arrest. Still, no answers. Jeff and Tim grew into adults. They got jobs. They started families of their own. They tried to move forward with their lives. But the case was always there, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Every anniversary of their mother's death was a reminder that her killer was still out there, walking free, living his life, while Linda lay in her grave. The Lakeland Police Department never officially closed the case. It remained open, technically active, but with no new leads, there wasn't much they could do. Every few years, a detective might take another look at the file, hoping to find something that previous investigators had missed. But nothing ever came of it. Meanwhile, the evidence that had been collected in 1981 sat in storage. The biological samples, the crime scene photographs, the witness statements. All of it just sat there, collecting dust. But here's the thing about cold cases. Sometimes technology catches up. Sometimes science advances to the point where evidence that was useless in 1981 becomes the key to solving everything. And that's exactly what happened in the Linda Slaten case. By the late 2010s, DNA technology had advanced dramatically from where it was in 1981. Not only could scientists now analyze tiny samples of biological material, but they could also use something called genetic genealogy to identify suspects. Genetic genealogy is basically using DNA databases and family tree research to track down criminals. Here's how it works. Investigators take DNA from a crime scene and upload it to public genealogy databases. These databases are full of DNA profiles from people who submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. If the crime scene DNA matches anyone in the database, even a distant relative, investigators can use that match as a starting point. They build family trees, trace relationships, and eventually narrow down the list of potential suspects until they find their guy. This technique had already been used to solve some high-profile cold cases, including the Golden State Killer case in California. Law enforcement was starting to realize that genetic genealogy could be a game-changer for unsolved crimes. In 2019, the Lakeland Police Department decided to take another look at the Linda Slaten case. They pulled out that old biological evidence that had been sitting in storage for 38 years, and they sent it off for genetic genealogy analysis. What happened next would finally give Jeff and Tim Slaten the answers they had been waiting their entire lives for. The genetic genealogy results came back, and investigators had a hit. The DNA from the crime scene matched someone in a public genealogy database. Not a direct match, but a relative. A family connection that gave investigators a starting point. From there, the detectives started building family trees. They traced relationships going back generations. They identified potential suspects within the family line, and slowly, methodically, they narrowed down their list. Eventually, all the evidence pointed to one man, Joseph Mills. Now, when investigators first saw the name Joseph Mills, they probably didn't immediately recognize it. He wasn't on any suspect list from 1981. He had never been questioned in connection with Linda's murder. He was just a name that came out of the DNA analysis. But as they dug deeper into Mills's background, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. Joseph Mills had lived in Lakeland, Florida in 1981. Joseph Mills had coached youth football in Lakeland, Florida in 1981. Joseph Mills had been Tim Slaten's football coach. The killer hadn't been some random stranger who broke into Linda's house. He was someone who knew the family, someone who had been in their lives, someone who had been around Linda and her boys. For investigators, this revelation was both a breakthrough and a gut punch. The killer had been right there the whole time. He had literally stood behind Tim in a team photo. He had coached the boy whose mother he had murdered. It was almost too horrific to comprehend. In 2019, almost 38 years after Linda Slaten was murdered, the Lakeland Police Department arrested Joseph Mills. By this time, Mills was in his 60s. He had lived his entire adult life as a free man, never facing any consequences for what he had done in 1981. He had probably thought he had gotten away with it. He had probably assumed that after nearly 4 decades, no one would ever catch him. He was wrong. When police showed up to arrest Mills, he must have known it was over. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. There was no way to explain it away. No alibi that could save him. The science had finally caught up to him. Mills was charged with first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary. For Jeff and Tim Slaten, the arrest was something they had dreamed about for most of their lives. Finally, after all those years, they knew who had killed their mother. Finally, there was a name, a face, a person they could hold responsible. But the arrest also brought up a flood of complicated emotions. Tim had to grapple with the fact that his football coach, someone he had trusted, someone he had looked up to as a kid, had murdered his mother. He had to process the fact that all those memories from that football season were now tainted by this horrific truth. And he had to look at that team photo again, knowing what he now knew about the man standing behind him. After the arrest, the legal process began. And in cases like this, the legal process can be long and complicated. Mills was facing the death penalty. Florida has capital punishment, and this was exactly the kind of case where prosecutors might seek the ultimate penalty: a brutal murder with sexual assault. Nearly 4 decades of the victim's family living in anguish. A killer who had evaded justice for almost 40 years. But death penalty cases are expensive and time-consuming. They involve years of appeals and motions. And there's always the possibility that something could go wrong, that the defendant could be acquitted on a technicality, or that the sentence could be overturned on appeal. For the Slaten brothers, the idea of going through a long trial was daunting. They had already waited 38 years. Did they want to wait another decade while the case worked its way through the court system? As it turned out, they didn't have to. In 2022, Joseph Mills agreed to plead guilty to the charges against him. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Mills would be sentenced to life in prison instead. Some people might question that deal. Why let a brutal murderer escape the death penalty? But for Jeff and Tim Slaten, the deal made sense. It meant closure. It meant certainty. It meant that Joseph Mills would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And there would be no appeals, no retrials, no chance that he could ever walk free again. And it meant that they would finally get their chance to confront the man who had destroyed their family. The sentencing hearing for Joseph Mills took place in 2022. And for the first time in their lives, Jeff and Tim Slaten got to stand in front of their mother's killer and tell him exactly what he had done to them. Imagine standing in a courtroom, looking at the man who murdered your mother when you were a child. Imagine having to put into words the decades of pain and fear and anger that you've carried. Imagine trying to express what it's like to grow up without your mother, knowing that she was taken from you in the most violent way possible. That's what Jeff and Tim had to do. Tim talked about the image that had been burned into his brain when he was 12 years old. That split-second glimpse of his mother's body that had haunted him for 4 decades. He talked about the fear he had lived with, the nightmares, the inability to ever feel truly safe. And he talked about that team photo, the photo he had kept all those years without knowing the truth, the photo that now represented the ultimate betrayal. Jeff talked about sleeping with a knife under his pillow, about the years of looking over his shoulder, about the weight of not knowing who had killed their mother. Both brothers made it clear to Joseph Mills that while he had lived his life freely for 38 years, they had been serving a sentence of their own, a sentence of grief and fear and unanswered questions. Joseph Mills sat there and listened. Whether he felt any remorse is hard to say. Some killers express regret when they're finally caught. Others seem hollow and unfeeling until the very end. What we do know is that when the hearing was over, Joseph Mills was led away in handcuffs to spend the rest of his life in prison. And for the first time in 41 years, Jeff and Tim Slaten could finally breathe. Even with Joseph Mills behind bars, there are questions that will probably never be answered. Why did Mills kill Linda Slaten? What was his connection to her? Had he been stalking her? Had he been watching the family because he was Tim's coach? Or was Linda just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Mills never provided a detailed explanation for his crime. He pleaded guilty, but he didn't give a full confession where he laid out exactly what happened and why. So the specific motive remains murky. Some investigators believe that Mills likely had other victims. Serial killers don't usually start with a murder this brutal and then stop. There may be other cases out there that are connected to Mills, other families that are still waiting for answers. If Mills did have other victims, those families may never get justice. Mills is already serving a life sentence. Even if he were charged with other crimes, it wouldn't really change his punishment. He's going to die in prison either way. That's one of the frustrating things about cases like this. Even when you catch the killer, you might not get all the answers. You might not ever fully understand what happened and why. The Linda Slaten case is one of many cold cases that have been solved in recent years thanks to advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy. In the past decade, Genetic genealogy has been used to solve cases that were decades old. The Golden State Killer, who terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s, was caught in 2018 using this technique. Countless other cold cases have been solved the same way. For families who have been waiting years or even decades for answers, these advances offer hope. Evidence that was useless in 1981 can now crack a case wide open. Killers who thought they got away with murder are discovering that the past is catching up to them. And for law enforcement, genetic genealogy has become a powerful tool. It's not foolproof, and it raises some privacy concerns that society is still working through. But it has undeniably brought justice to victims and their families who had given up hope. The Linda Slaten case is ultimately a story about patience, persistence, and the long arc of justice. For 38 years, Linda's killer walked free. For 38 years, her sons lived with the trauma of her death and the frustration of not knowing who was responsible. For 38 years, a football coach went about his life, coaching other kids, living in the community, pretending to be a normal person. But in the end, justice found him. It didn't happen quickly, it didn't happen easily, but it happened. And that's something. It's not everything. It doesn't bring Linda back. It doesn't erase the decades of pain that Jeff and Tim went through, but it's something. Joseph Mills will die in prison. He will never hurt anyone again, and Jeff and Tim Slaten can finally say that they know who killed their mother, and that person is paying the price. Sometimes, that's all you can ask for. The Linda Slaten case is a reminder that every victim matters, that every cold case deserves another look, and that sometimes, even after decades of nothing, justice can still be served. If you want to see more stories like this one, click on the video on your screen right now.